Hello everyone, my name is Kaelyn Grace Apple and I am a second-year PhD student in History and African American Studies at Yale University. And today I am finally making the video that all of you have been asking for so long, which is my How I Got Into Yale video. Before we get started, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of backstory into my educational history in case you are curious. Your application is your own. Every subject at Yale or at any other school for graduate study is going to be different in what they look for in an applicant. Even in your subfield and in your research interests, your skills and the types of things that a committee member is going to be looking for on your application is going to vary depending on your subject. If you want to learn more about how to develop a strategy for graduate school admissions, go ahead and check out Accepted Consulting. We have free master classes, office hours, as well as one-on-one consultations. However, our current pool is limited. We are currently almost at capacity. We are taking a maximum of 45 active clients at any given time. When the slots for my clients who are currently applying to Oxbridge open up in September, October, those slots may become available. So keep an eye on the website as well as at Accepted Consulting on Instagram in order to figure out when we will have availability. We are currently available right now, but I can't say that is going to be true by the time this video goes up. All right, so my academic history goes all the way back to when I started community college. When I graduated high school, I graduated with a 2.9 GPA. I was not a very good student at all. I wasn't very interested in academics and I was not planning on pursuing going to college. I ended up going to community college and riding horses professionally. The first semester that I was in community college, I ended up with a 2.0 GPA and a letter from the dean saying that I needed to be making more progress in my courses in order to remain at that particular community college. I did not think that you could actually get bumped from community college, but you can if you are not making progress, and I was not. So I ended up doing 2 semesters at community college and really hating it and ultimately dropping out. I rode horses professionally for 2 years, and ultimately about a year into my professional athletics career, I decided that I really wanted to go back to school. I had this craving for learning. I had had a riding accident where I hurt my shoulder and I had to be laid up for a little while. I really discovered a love for history by reading public history biographies on figures from the founding era, as well as this book on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. It's called An American Controversy. It's by Annette Gordon Reed. This book had a really transformative impact on me as an individual as well as my scholarship. I ended up going back to school, developing study habits, and figuring out how it was that I could actually manage to transfer. However, when I was planning on transferring, I was still carrying that very low GPA from the beginning. I ended up getting B's and then A's as I progressed through my academic career in community college. I ended up taking classes I really enjoyed and ultimately really found a fascination with the history of slavery, the British Empire, and the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th century. And the reason that's important is because there was this kind of seed planted then that I was really fascinated in research, which then kind of grew as I went into college. So when I applied for college, I was definitely on the low end of the GPA spectrum for those that would be accepted to the programs that I did get into. I got into almost every school I applied to when I transferred, and I ultimately went to UCLA, where I received my BA in History and African American Studies. As a junior undergraduate, I pursued an honors thesis with my advisor. This was on Black loyalists or slaves who fled to the British during the American Revolution. I also did an independent study with one of my favorite professors, Dr. Brenda Stevenson, where I began thinking about the project I wanted to pursue in graduate school. The summer between my junior and senior year, I studied abroad at Cambridge and studied legal history. And this is where the seed was planted for my love of legal history. And so I ultimately developed this project under the tutelage and mentorship of Dr. Brenda Stevenson, as well as the other professors within the history department at UCLA, and decided that I wanted to apply to master's programs abroad in the UK. There was a couple different reasons I wanted to study in the UK, and this is important because I needed to be able to discuss this when I applied for PhDs. So one reason being that a lot of the archives and materials that I wanted to look at were going to be in the UK, and I also wanted to be trained in British legal history on top of colonial American history because they are so deeply intertwined. Obviously they stem from the same legal system, in which case I thought it was going to be important to be in the UK and to develop that knowledge. And so I ended up getting into the University of Oxford, where I pursued my 9-month master's. It's known as as the Master of Studies at Oxford in US History. While I was at Oxford, I took coursework on women and gender history in America, as well as various courses on theory, methods, and historiography. I wrote my dissertation on a matrilineal descent law, which was passed in Virginia in 1662, and that project ended up becoming what I wanted to pursue in my PhD. So let's back it up to when I actually applied to Yale and the process that actually got me here. At the beginning of the application process, I went through over 30 interviews with professors, graduate students, supporting faculty, etc., at numerous schools across the United States. The criteria I was looking for in a PhD program were that it needed to have a law school, it needed to have a strong history department in early America, and it also needed to have an African American Studies department. Those were the three criteria that I really looked for. The only school that was an exception to the final one about having an AFAM department was Stanford. So I set up calls with professors from across the United States. I interviewed with UChicago, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, UPenn, UVA, and several others. Ultimately, my list narrowed down to Yale, Harvard, UVA, UPenn, and Stanford, and those were the only 5 that I applied to. Something that was important about the process was actually going into these interviews and having my pitch prepared. I have other videos on my channel about reaching out to potential advisors, how to actually craft the email, and what it is that you should prepare for the interview, but I'm not going to discuss that too far in depth in this video. However, what I will say is that my conversations with the professors and the Yale history department were incredibly positive. Not only did I feel like their expertise aligned very well with my interests, but they actually seemed very excited about my project, and that was something that was crucial for any program that I wanted to apply for. I wanted to make sure that I was going to be working with a potential advisor who was really excited about the project in the way that I was. Additionally, one of the most appealing things about Yale was that there was the joint PhD program in history and African American studies. If I was going to be studying slavery and studying gender and enslavement, that I really wanted to be in a program that had a strong African American studies curriculum and where I could work with professors across different departments. That was something that was absolutely crucial. That was something that was really important to me. So that's a little bit of backstory. I wanted to say all of these things because those were the reasons I wanted to go to Yale and why I applied. And it's important to say because PhD admissions is so intricate and is all about strategy, but it is also about luck. So making sure that you are well matched for a PhD program, that they are going to want you, that you want them, is important because as that committee is reviewing your application, they're looking to make sure that you are deeply interested in them, and that if they are going to extend an offer of acceptance, that you are likely going to take it. Knowing your stuff, knowing why you're applying, not only for research reasons and for the prestige of the university, but also for the specifics of your research is going to be important because you want to be able to indicate those things in your statement of purpose to demonstrate to that committee that this is a school you really want to be at. So let's talk a little bit about the components of the Yale history PhD application. Every application is going to be different. So I work in graduate school admissions. I have an academic consulting business that I have been running for over a year and a half now. I've worked with over 400 clients, and there is definitely a lot of strategy that goes into these applications depending on what components are being asked of you. So I'm going to tell you the components that were in my application, but I want you to take this with a grain of salt because if you are applying to PhD programs, you may be asked for something slightly different, and the types of things that you're going to need to submit may be ever so slightly different than what I had to submit. So just keep that in mind. One of the main components of a PhD application, which is pretty standard across the board, is a statement of purpose or a statement of intent or a statement of intended research. I have other videos on my channel, and I will be working on a new series on PhD applications where I will talk about how to write a statement of purpose. And at the end of this video, I'm actually going to read you the statement of purpose that got me into Yale, similar to the way that I made my video on how I got into Oxford. So hang tight for that because I'm actually going to share the statement of purpose with you, and then subscribe to the channel if you want more information about how you can write your statement of purpose. The second component was the written sample. This is pretty standard for social science and humanities programs for you to submit a written sample. I believe it had to be about 25 pages, so I ended up using the analysis section of my my undergraduate thesis. I added a cover letter on top stating where in the thesis it was coming from, what the general subject of the thesis was, and why I had included it as my written sample. Whatever section you end up using for a written sample, you can always add a cover letter just stating essentially what the project was and what piece they're reading of it. Next, I had to submit letters of recommendation. For Yale, I believe I submitted the maximum, which was 5 letters of recommendation. I ended up using letters from my undergraduate honors thesis advisor, Dr. Brenda Stevenson, who again I worked with on that independent study project, as well as my advisor from Oxford. Additionally, I had a professor that I'd taken multiple classes with at UCLA who knew me really well. He knew me since the first semester that I got to UCLA, and I knew him very personally. He was a really good mentor to me. And the final one was a professor that I had taken 2 classes with, and she was actually the professor who taught the history of sexual violence class that you'll hear me talk about in the statement of purpose. That class was really formative for my idea about this project. So it was important for me to have that letter included. And also she's somebody that I really respected as a mentor, and I still do. So I made sure that I was including recommenders that I had a really strong positive relationship with, which I did. I had really positive relationships with my professors at UCLA. So those were the recommendations that I ended up using. My suggestion for you, if you are applying to Yale, whatever program you're applying for, is to focus on the quality of your relationship with that person and think about what type of work they've seen you do. If they knew you just from lecture, they probably don't know you very well. Whereas if you worked with them as an advisor and they worked with you on a larger year-long project, you're gonna have a very different type of relationship. Next are the 2 components that not every application asks for. This is very specific to the Yale History PhD program, as well as the humanities programs at Yale, which was the book review and the diversity statement. So first I'll talk a little bit about the book review. The book review that I was planning on writing was on David Brian Davis's Inhuman Bondage. However, as I started reading it, I realized that David Brian Davis was the founder of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, and that anybody that was going to be reading my book review was likely going to know the material like the back of their hand, and I didn't feel like I knew the book well enough in order to comment and write a thorough review. However, I had written a book review on Florian Scheilen's Black People in Britain, which was a book that I read during my independent study with Brenda Stevenson. So I ended up using that book as my book review. My recommendation is, if you are asked for a book review, is to use something that is as closely aligned to your project as possible. They're likely going to provide guidelines for you on the website, so I don't really need to go into depth on this, but I ended up picking a book that I felt like I knew quite well, and that aligned quite well with my research interests. Then the next thing is the diversity statement. This is pretty standard for Yale, especially in the humanities and the social sciences. I'm not entirely sure if it's required for STEM or if it's required for any of the public health masters or the School of Management. They have their own systems of application, so it may be different than the graduate school at Yale. However, the diversity statement is something that trips a lot of people up, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about the strategy that I used to write mine. With my diversity statement, I focused on having had a background that was different and very unique to me. So the diversity statement, a lot of people think that you need to focus on something that identifies you as different by means of gender, race, sexual orientation, etc. The things that we often think about with diversity. But what I thought about when I was working on that statement, and the recommendation that I have for any one of my clients, is to think of diversity as anything that sets you apart from others in that cohort. What is it about you, your background, your research, your perspective that informs your research and informs who you are as a student and how you kind of enter a educational space? I actually spoke about having come from a professional athletics career. I had no intention of going to school when I was 18, and I actually chose to return to school due to my fascination with history. And that I approached my research in a very different way, having come from having had a career as a professional athlete and using that kind of work ethic in order to determine what was important about the research that I was doing and how to dedicate myself to different areas of my research. Beyond that, I talked about having worked in this space as an athlete and having to work on a team and having to work with coaches, having to work with my boss, having to work with various clients, and how that has informed my ability to manage relationships and collaborate with others. So whatever it is about your background that separates you from the rest, that is what you want to indicate in a diversity statement. It doesn't have to be something about general social identity. However, it can. If that is something that truly does inform your experience, that is something you should talk about. So why is it that my application was selected and why did I get into Yale? Part of this is honestly luck. It's about the timing. I applied during a year which was a high yield admissions year. So I believe there were 25 students that were selected for the PhD program in history. However, I was the only person selected for the combined PhD program in history and African American studies. The year that I was selected, 2 people were selected for early American history, myself and one other person, whereas other subfields in history had more representation. So for example, the 20th century historians had a higher yield, whereas if you're in a more specialized field such as early America, so you're studying 17th, 18th century, or if you're coming in to study China, for example, then those subfields will yield less students. And these decisions change every single year. There is no way to gauge it from inside or outside. You just have to do your best to apply to that program, knowing that it may or may not be your year. I was lucky because I applied the year before the COVID pandemic had a huge impact on admissions. Last year, admissions were much higher, so there was a higher number of students applying with far fewer seats at Yale and other institutions. Some institutions even closed their doors to incoming PhD students. So I feel like I was really lucky to have gotten in when I did. Other things that played into my acceptance, I think, are also that the GRE was not required for the history department. However, my application was for history and African American studies. So my application had to be looked at by the committee for history as well as for African American studies, and AFAM studies actually did require the GRE. So my rather low GRE score was looked at, though I don't believe that it was reviewed very heavily. There are some programs that do require the GRE while others do not. Every other school I applied to required the GRE, in which case I think it actually hurt me a lot in the application process. In terms of my GPA, I had a very positive GPA. I had quite a bit of research experience when I applied, so I think that definitely helped. But the one thing that I was told that really set my application apart from others was my written sample. The written sample that I submitted was, again, for my undergraduate honors thesis, which was a quantitative study of this one evacuation record. It was a project that I am very proud of. It is a project I have now gone to conferences on to present. I am also working on turning it into an article. If you want to know more about that project, I actually have a video of me presenting that work at a conference. But that was the project that I ended up submitting for my written sample, and I think that definitely helped. I've been told that it was what helped. It was also the thing that I was told got me into Oxford. So having a really strong written sample was, if anything, probably the most important reason why I got into Yale. However, there are always other circumstances that I will never know of why the committee decided to go with me. I don't know what the letter's recommendations said. I've never read them. And another thing to note is that it is also based on luck. For example, if I had said that I wanted to work with another one of the faculty members as my primary advisor, she wasn't taking students that year. So it really depends on who you want to work with, the timing of it all, the research, your written sample. There are so many components that go into the PhD application, and it's all about strategy. I did so much research on all of the schools that I applied to, but particularly Yale, in order to make sure that my statement of purpose was very well catered to this program. Yale was my dream school upon all dream schools, and I feel so absolutely blessed that I am here now. I am still in awe that I got into this school. I absolutely love it here. My cohort is incredible, and all you'd have to do in order to know what my life is like here as a PhD student is watch my vlogs. So now I'm gonna go ahead and get into the part of the video that I'm sure you all are waiting for, which is to actually read the written sample that got me into Yale. Okay, I'm like nervous to share this. All right, let's get into it. During my doctoral studies, I hope to research 2 aspects of a comparative legal history project on slavery in the British Atlantic. First, my research aims to uncover matrilineal legal precedents that existed in English common law. as the possible foundation for the implementation of parta sequitur ventrem in the American colonies. While the standard in English descent law was parta sequitur patrem, which established a patrilineal line of conditional descent, the implementation of parta sequitur ventrem appears as an aside to the status quo. Under parta sequitur ventrem, colonists enacted positive law which pledged the condition of slavery onto the offspring of every enslaved woman. While my first research interest focuses on the intersection of legal history, slavery studies, and gender, the second aims to look more broadly at the relationship between England and her colonies through the institution of slavery. David Bryan Davis argued that the Somerset v. Stuart case of 1772 was a turning point for the English Empire, signaling the operation of two distinct systems of law. According to Davis, Somerset was the impetus for England and her colonies operating separately on the question of slavery. I wish to support the argument that a fracture in the empire had existed since the 17th century, when colonists enacted parta sequitur ventrem. While historians such as Davis and Winthrop Jordan have indicated how race was defined and codified in colonial slave laws, they paid little attention to how gender was similarly mechanized as a justification for slavery. It is this oversight I wish to explore in further depth. The questions I seek to explore during my doctoral studies are the result of curiosity and ongoing research on the experiences of enslaved persons during the colonial and revolutionary periods in America. During my undergraduate studies at UCLA, I wrote an honors thesis that centered the historiographical discourse on Black loyalists, the slaves who fled to the British during the American Revolution, and the lives of Virginia slaves listed in the Book of Negroes. With the mentorship of my advisor, I managed to compile a database based on the list of runaways provided in the Book of Negroes, which I then used to support my findings and compare them to what had been previously stated. While I had originally focused on individual plantation records, such as Thomas Jefferson's Farm Book, to comprehend the movements and motivations of runaway slaves, I discovered that by mining the Book of Negroes for clues, I could extract more comprehensive findings. One of the most important things was that slaves fleeing from the Virginia interior must have accessed major waterways, such as rivers, to reach British camps along the Chesapeake. In addition to writing my thesis, the most formative aspect of my time at UCLA was the mentorship I received from professors in a variety of disciplines and the graduate level courses I was lucky enough to take. While studying history and African American studies, I discovered the importance of interdisciplinary work. As a senior, I took a graduate seminar on the history of sexual violence, which covered studies of sexual violence from local, transnational, and global perspectives, and included long discussions about wartime violence, gendered violence, and whether or not agency or resistance should be ascribed to individual historical actors. In Dr. class, I began to grapple with the book that had begun my interest in the study of the enslaved, Annette Gordon Reed's Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. My final paper focused on how historians had written about Jefferson and Hemings, starting with Dumas Malone and ending with a discussion of Brenda Stevens' review of Gordon Reed's The Hemingses of Monticello. I had to return to the sources and grapple with not only the arguments brought forward by historians, but how they managed to look at the same sources and argue such divergent conclusions. While my academic interest had begun with the study of history of racial inequality in America, the scope has since shifted to a fascination with how gendered inequality also had an important impact on the institution of slavery. Now, as a master's student at Oxford, I continue to grapple with similar questions regarding the actions and agency of the enslaved, as well as the colonists who enslaved them. While my undergraduate studies focus primarily on social histories and the study of individuals and census records, I hope to expand my research skills into the realm of legal history. My goal is to pursue a career as a legal historian. As one step of many, I hope to learn to engage with court records, statutory precedents, and secondary literature to begin answering questions which have long occupied my mind and carry these interests forward into a doctoral program. I've chosen to apply to Yale's joint PhD program in History and African American Studies for the following reasons. First, I wish to work with After speaking with him about his recent book, I firmly believe that while working with him, I would gain critical skills in research and interpreting legal documents. In addition, I hope to work with their work on Black women's history would be invaluable as I seek interdisciplinary mentorship throughout my doctoral studies. Secondly, I wish to study at Yale due to its history of supporting scholars from across disciplines, especially those studying the history of slavery. I wish to develop my research in a program which encourages me to learn skills not only within the discipline of history, but at the intersection of other fields as well. Yale's combined history PhD program would be invaluable to my development as a researcher and educator. With the guidance of the History and African American Studies faculty, I am certain my studies at Yale would act as a continuation of my positive experience as an aspiring scholar and prepare me for a future career as a legal historian. All right, so I just want to quickly touch on a couple things that I actually would do very differently now that I have worked on hundreds of graduate school applications. I was not very specific about the information related to the advisor I wanted to work with, and I did not include very much information as to why I wanted to be at Yale other than the interdisciplinary aspect of the program. If I were to rewrite this now, I wouldn't change the proposal, but I would change the information I included in the background. I would include way more information about the sources and the way that it was analyzed. And secondly, I wouldn't use such broad statements as interdisciplinary. I would have been a lot more descriptive about the type of work I was planning on doing and how working with this variety of faculty would have an impact on different aspects of my training. Additionally, I would have talked more specifically about resources. So my Y section, I thought it had included a piece on the Gilder Lehrman Center, but I believe that may have been in my diversity statement. One of the main reasons I wanted to come to Yale was because there is this center called the Gilder Lehrman Center, which focuses on this kind of public-facing work of history in the field of slavery. So they do a lot of work on African American history. They offer a lot of public lectures, and they also broadcast a lot of their talks online. This was something that was really important to me in community college because I actually learned a lot from these public lectures, and I think it's really important that historians are doing this public-facing work. And I thought I had talked about it in the statement of purpose, but I guess I had not. I had not reread this entire statement in at least a year. So these are things that I would have done differently and definitely would have made my statement of purpose stronger. I think this is like a good statement of purpose, but it could have been a lot better. So I actually have a video coming up very soon about how to write a statement of purpose. So keep an eye out for that because that's going to include a lot more detail. I'm actually going to take you sentence by sentence into how I edit a statement of purpose and the things that you should and shouldn't do. So I hope that this was helpful. It was really interesting going back and reading what my research interests were then, because while they're still very similar, they have changed a little. So it's always interesting going back and reading your writing, but also reading applications is just so, I don't know, it's fascinating to me. All right, everyone, we have now come to the end of today's video. I hope that it was helpful for you and that you enjoyed it. This is a video that was a long time coming, and I finally wanted to sit down and present it for you all. If you enjoyed, please remember to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button because there is a lot of academic lifestyle content coming for you this fall. We are heading back to campus this year. I'm gonna get a lot of vlogs, and I'm really excited to share it all with you. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye, everyone.